home from war in one piece externally, with no missing limbs or visible scars, but being broken internally. Imagine returning to a society that is putting itself back together again, but no longer knowing where you fit in that society. This was the lived experience shared by many soldiers returning home from World War I. The Great War laid waste to a continent and destroyed the hopes and lives of a generation. Before it was all over, nearly every family in Europe was grieving the loss of a family member or caring for a wounded soldier struggling to adjust to civilian life. J.R.R. Tolkien was one of these veterans whose whole life was occupied by war, both the wars he fought himself and the ones fought by his children. Tolkien lived through the Battle of the Somme, trench fever, and the interwar period. Adjusting to life back home was no easy feat, but Tolkien found solace in the world of Middle-earth that he created, and he also yearned to craft a national mythology for England. Tolkien realized that there was no distinctive mythology for England, and this inspired him to create Middle-earth. Although there are many works that contributed to Tolkien's English mythology, I am reading Tolkien's The Hobbit, published in 1937, as his attempt to create a piece of this national mythology during the interwar period. Because of the social climate after World War I, Tolkien's mythology had to appeal both to the broken souls returning from war and those surviving the home front, while still appealing to his most important audience, which was his children. The returning veterans, many of whom were suffering from undiagnosed shell shock, more commonly known today as post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, were trying to forget the horrors of war while attempting to adjust to interwar English society. Tolkien's mythology would have been incomplete if it did not find a place for them within it. A character from The Hobbit who embodies the veteran's liminal identity is the bear man shapeshifter figure, Beorn. Beorn, an ill-tempered but fierce ally, is only obviously present in 2 of the novel's 19 chapters, but the ramifications of his actions alter the path of the tale's protagonist, Bilbo Baggins, and the journey he embarks on. However, why is there so much emphasis on Beorn's 2 forms and temperament, but so little explained about his past? Further, there are many characters in his story who have endured the horrors of war, such as Bilbo and Thorin. So why include Beorn as another traumatized character? After the Battle of the 5 Armies, Bilbo returns home to the Shire and resumes his life, and Thorin does not get to return home as he perishes in battle. So where does this leave Beorn? He returns home to his Norse hall, but Beorn is still displaced from his original home in the mountains, and he is left to wander the 2 worlds of bear and man for the remainder of his life. According to original manuscripts, there were considerable edits done to Beorn's character, revealing Tolkien's evolving and revolving thought process about the exact nature of the enigmatic Beorn. There is debate on exactly what type of being Beorn is, an enchanted cursed man or a magical bear. Regardless of his primary form, there was great thought put into such a minor yet significant character. Tolkien sought to write a national mythology for England during the interwar period when the world that he once knew was shattered. However, Tolkien had to provide a liminal voice in his narrative who could speak to and acknowledge his trauma, as many veterans, quote, spoke of having inhabited 2 distinct worlds, of having seemed 2 distinct persons, end quote. Beorn is one character from this mythology who, I will argue, provides a significant voice for Tolkien and all World War I veterans who may have physically returned home from war, but who remained in a liminal space between worlds because of the trauma experienced. While The Hobbit is not a strict allegory for Tolkien's involvement in World War I, he embeds his experiences of war and the liminal feeling of returning home within his mythology, and specifically in the character of Beorn, in order to express his trauma without directly having to speak about it. Tolkien's mythology is one that is deeply rooted and shaped by a medieval past, but was still applicable for his interwar readership. However, writing a mythology in a post-World War I society was a delicate task, as Paul Fussell states in his book, The Great War in Modern Memory. He says, "One of the cruxes of the war, of course, is the collision between events and language available, or thought appropriate to describe them. Whatever the cause, the presumed inadequacy of language itself to convey the facts about trench warfare is one of the motifs of all who wrote about the war." So although his primary audience was his children, he was nonetheless writing a tale of battle and war in a social climate where wounds of trench warfare were still fresh. Therefore, Tolkien devised an alternative manner of expression, his fantastical world of Middle-earth, to illustrate the destruction of war and to mirror the liminal experience felt by himself and other veterans as they returned home from war. When many of the soldiers from World War I returned home, their conditions did not improve. After the war, many soldiers, their lasting memory was of the very image of the marginal, the liminal, the betwixt and between, no man's land. For many, the unknown world beyond was an obsession, beyond the wire fence, beyond their trench, beyond the years of the war. Most of these veterans were condemned to a liminal life, first on the margins of the battlefield, then on the margins of society. Because of this negative social stigma, the mentally alienated veterans sequestered in asylums were considered les morts vivants, the living dead. Veterans tried to transition into life back home, and some used silence to avoid reliving the trauma experience on the battlefields. Once veterans returned, one of the most significant responses to the feeling of psychic and social estrangement from civilian life was the ritualization and memorialization of the war experience in veterans groups. Because Tolkien lost all of his friends but one to the war, his world of Middle-earth and the tales of battle associated with it may have been a way for him to join in this memorialization. When veterans from World War I, quote, left behind the boundaries of their own societies to take up arms against other men, notes Leeds, they are seen to have either transcended purely social categories or to have fallen below them. They emerged with sacred figures or animal categories, becoming like gods or beasts, often taking on the raiment and habits of animals, such as bear shirts. In light of his experiences in World War I, it would be natural for Tolkien to include a character in his mythology that provided a voice for veterans who transcended the boundaries of society and inhabited a bear shirt for the greater good of others. Coleridge states that Tolkien's works contain 20th century resonances, the sense of despair and anguish in total world war, where nameless thousands die often without notice or glory in nightmarish conflicts. Therefore, Tolkien could not write a mythology that included an idealistic view of war, warriors, and veterans, as it is often portrayed in classical Western mythology. Instead, he created a story like The Hobbit, where some warriors perish, some return home to resume their lives, and others roam the wild world in search of who they are as their original identity was lost. While it would be a disservice to read The Hobbit as an uncompromising allegory for World War I, it does contain landscapes and characters that would speak to the shared experience of Tolkien's readership during the interwar period. Indeed, there has been ample research and work done on Bilbo as a typical soldier embarking on a heroic adventure of war. This analysis is helpful for following the main heroic narrative of the story, which more or less ends happily for Bilbo as the hero of the tale. The reader does not see Bilbo's post-war persona in The Hobbit, but we are told that though he has lost his reputation among the conservative hobbits of the Shire, he remained happy to the end of his days. However, if The Hobbit is to be a part of a national mythology for England, there needs to be a character within it who speaks to the trauma, both seen and unseen, of the veterans after the war. As we may all know, Beorn fits well into Tolkien's mythological framework, as both his name and characteristics are based on the medieval Norse mythologies that shaped Tolkien's world of Middle-earth. Beorn exhibits some symptoms that bear similarities to PTSD, such as irritability, anger, and aversion to social settings, as seen in his interactions with Gandalf, Bilbo, and the dwarves early on in Chapter 7. Gandalf warns Bilbo and the dwarves that, quote, he gets angry easily, and you must be careful not to annoy him. Beorn's temperament is obviously unstable and unpredictable, as Gandalf must play some sort of a game if he's going to approach him with a large crowd of dwarves. He says, "You had better wait here," said the wizard to the dwarves, "and when I call you or whistle, begin to come in, but only in pairs." Gandalf is trying not to overwhelm Beorn, as Beorn's reactions to surprise guests can be a little erratic. Beorn's unpredictable nature is not only questioned in his man form, but also in his bear form. For instance, when Bilbo is sleeping inside of the hall, he hears a, quote, a growling sound outside and a noise as of some great animal scuffling at the door, end quote. Bilbo wonders if the beast was Beorn in his enchanted shape and if he would come in and as a bear and kill them. While his intentions have been good towards Bilbo and the dwarves, as he fed them and has given them shelter before they venture into Mirkwood, Bilbo still fears for his life at the hands of Beorn in his bear form. Beorn's instability in both skins and his mistrust of strangers coming into his home demonstrates that he may have been traumatized from previous encounters with intruders in his homeland. Tom Shippey identifies that Beorn has, quote, a strange combination of gruffness and good humor, ferocity and kind-heartedness, with a quality which one might call being insufficiently socialized, all caused, of course, by the fact that he has more than one skin and is a skin changer. While I do agree with Shippey that Beorn's unpredictable nature and dual personality is due to the fact that he lives between the worlds of bear and man, his erratic behavior and personality may also be explained by Beorn's long history and being displaced from his original home. Similarly, some veterans may feel the tension between the two conflicting roles that they are expected to fill, that of a heroic war veteran and a citizen living among those who did not go to war, and they find they cannot occupy both of these identities. Just as veterans' families and friends at home would have known little about the trauma that they experienced at the battlefront, the reader knows little about Beorn and his past. Because the characters are unaware of Beorn's exact lineage, or the reason behind his temperament as a bear or a man, he is othered, further limiting anyone's understanding of him. There is minimal information about Beorn's past or ancestry in any of Tolkien's mythologies. He is not mentioned in the Silmarillion, and it is said that Tolkien created the character with, quote, some uncertainty about just what sort of being Beorn was, quote, end quote, as his manuscripts showed considerable edits to the information given about Beorn's character. Although The Hobbit does not go into detail about Beorn's past exploits, Gandalf implies that Beorn was impacted by war of some form, and that his ancestors resided in the area surrounding the Misty Mountains prior to Smaug and the orcs' occupation of them. Some say that he is a bear descended from the great and ancient bears of the mountain that lived there before the giants came. Others say that he is a man descended from the first men who lived before Smaug and the other dragons came into this part of the world, and before the goblins came into the hills out of the north. I cannot say, though I fancy the last is the true tale. Gandalf's uncertainty about Beorn's past illustrates that his history is truly unknown, for if anyone would know, Gandalf would. Everyone's lack of knowledge about who Beorn is and where he comes from shows how he is not only liminal, but misunderstood by the characters, the narrator, and his readership. This misunderstanding is what Tolkien and other veterans may have experienced when they tried to speak about their experiences of war with those at home who could not possibly understand what they endured. Although Beorn is only present in 2 chapters of the novel, there was great thought and purpose put into the creation of his character, and specifically his shape-shifting nature. Being able to shift between the body of a man and a bear warrior allows Beorn to try to separate his life at home and his life at war. The reader is given the impression that the primary figure for Beorn is his human form, as Bilbo refers to Beorn's bear form as his enchanted shape, and Gandalf predicts that he is a man descended from the first men who lived before Smaug. As a man, he remains in his home that is highly ordered and feudal in nature, as he takes on the duty of host and overseer of his guests and animals. His actions as a man are calculated and controlling. He is described as, quote, a man who keeps cattle and horses. They work for him and talk to him. He does not eat them, neither does he hunt or eat wild animals. The ordered nature and absence of violence in his Norse hall highlights the apparent absence of trauma in both his man form and his home. In contrast, Beorn uses his bear form during times of war where he can utilize his ferocious beast abilities, and he can contain most of the trauma that may be associated with war in that form. It is not the fact that Beorn is able to access his trauma that makes him a good warrior, though, but the fact that he can compartmentalize it into 2 separate worlds that makes him effective in times of need. Beorn is very much like those veterans who continue to be troubled psychically by their war experience, were troubled by the sense of having lived 2 lives and being unable to resolve the contradictions between them. These contradictions or ambiguities between the 2 lives and 2 worlds lived by veterans could explain why some of who they are at war bleeds its way into who they are at home. Similarly, Beorn is illustrated as 2 almost completely different characters in his activities as a bear and a man, but his 2 personas are more blended than they may appear. Not only are Beorn's liminal identity and trauma characterized by his demeanor, but they are also represented by the geographical location of his lodging. In his man form, Beorn is in a constant state of fear because of where he lives. He explains this fear by saying, quote, if you lived near the edge of Mirkwood, you would take the word of no one. Just as veterans are stuck between 2 worlds, Beorn's existence is one roughly hewn out of the hard landscape in the liminal space between the awe-inspiring peaks of the Misty Mountain and the dark gloom of the Mirkwood Forest. His geographically liminal identity can be seen in Tolkien's map included in many versions of the novel. Beorn's lodging is clearly on its own in between these 2 landforms, the Misty Mountains and the Mirkwood Forest, which are associated with evil and battle. This very deliberate positioning of Beorn's home could suggest that while it is a place of refuge from acts of violence, it is not far removed from potential war zones. The marginality of Beorn's home could mirror the life on the margins experienced by veterans as they struggle to survive both the home front and no man's land. Not only is Beorn's home physically on the margins and isolated from social life, but he is stuck between 2 landforms in the novel that are unknown and associated with uncanny creatures. This pain and trauma, as it is associated to landscapes, can be seen through Gandalf's observations of Beorn. I once saw him, or Beorn, sitting all alone at the top of the Carrick at night, watching the moon sinking towards the Misty Mountains, and I heard him growl in the tongue of bears, the day will come when they will perish and I shall go back. This is why I believe he once came from the mountains himself. Although Beorn's Norse Hall is a sign of safety for Bilbo and the dwarves, its location acts as a reminder of Beorn's displacement from his original home of his people. This could explain Beorn's profound hatred towards goblins, his act of hanging their skins and heads outside of his home, and his willingness to help Bilbo and the dwarves on their adventure to defeat Smaug. As LeConte tells us, like no other force in history, the First World War permanently altered the political and cultural landscape of Europe, America, and the West. For a generation of men and women, it brought the end of innocence and the end of faith. Tolkien creates Beorn as a liminal character in his national mythology who could speak to the widespread trauma that existed after the war. Beorn provides a figure with whom Tolkien and World War I veterans can relate. He has experienced the horrors in battle as a consequence, and as a consequence, he struggles to see where he belongs. The story of history has not ended happily for veterans of the Great War returning with invisible scars. During a tumultuous time, The Hobbit was an escape from the turbulence to an alternative realm where people are able to decisively win a battle and shift between identities when one of their worlds becomes too difficult to bear. Thank you.